In the biting winter of 1847, an entity arrived in the isolated, mountain-shrouded settlement of Milbrook, Vermont, unleashing a shadow that would cling to the survivors for the remainder of their days. They designated him Samuel Hawthorne, though this moniker is absent from all documented official records prior to that horrifying February evening when he materialized, struggling through a raging blizzard that had already claimed 17 souls across Windham County. The disturbing truths the locals uncovered about this man, who spoke of countries situated far past the mountain ranges and possessed a medical acumen that preserved dozens during a fatal outbreak of winter fever, would utterly shatter their confidence in the basic goodness of humanity and expose horrifying realities about survival that conventional minds refuse to accept. For over a century and 70 years, the Milbrook Historical Society has kept specific papers securely locked away from public access. These documents do more than merely illuminate who Samuel Hawthorne truly was. They meticulously detail the monstrous acts he undertook to endure his ordeal in those frozen peaks, and more unsettlingly, the horrific deeds he continued to commit long after he was ostensibly rescued. The actual story of Samuel Hawthorne is not a simple narrative of survival gone astray. It serves as a grim testament to the terrifying depths a human spirit can descend to when the binding structure of civilization is stripped away, revealing how genuine monsters can successfully conceal themselves behind the guise of saviors while subtly converting entire communities to their perverse ideology of existence. Before we delve further into the terrifying chronicle of Samuel Hawthorne and the winter that irrevocably altered Milbrook, please be sure to subscribe and activate that notification bell, as narratives like this delve deeply into America's most profound historical obscurities. Also, let us know in the comments section which state you are listening from, because you might be genuinely astonished by the number of similar, unexplained disappearances that occurred in your region during those punishing winters of the 1840s. The chilling frequency of unexplained disappearances that tracked Samuel Hawthorne's movements across New England ultimately affected more than 60 families spanning 4 different states. Yet the authorities failed to connect the incidents until it was tragically late. The accounts I am about to disclose originate from sources that have never been digitized, never been publicly released, and there is a compelling reason for this secrecy. They contain profoundly unsettling details regarding the nature of humanity that most people are not mentally prepared to confront. Milbrook, Vermont, in 1847, was an archetypal small town where everyone supposedly knew the affairs of their neighbors, or at least believed they did. Tucked away in a valley among the Green Mountains, roughly 40 miles northeast of Bennington, the town's total populace barely exceeded 300 individuals, predominantly comprised of farmers, loggers, and their families striving to carve out a respectable living from the unforgiving terrain. The settlement was founded in 1789 by veterans of the Revolutionary War seeking inexpensive land and a new start. By the 1840s, however, it had become one of those forgotten communities existing in the vast, remote gaps between larger towns, connected to the outside world solely by dangerous mountain routes that became utterly impassable for months during the winter season. The winter of 1846 to 1847 had proven exceptionally harsh, with temperatures dropping so severely that Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, a physician educated at Harvard who had arrived in Milbrook in 1843, pursuing a quieter life after his Boston practice, was ruined by gambling debts, documented in his personal journal that whiskey solidified in bottles left exposed overnight. The Connecticut River, which usually supplied the town with fresh water and served as a route for commerce, had frozen to a depth of 4 feet by January. Even the most seasoned residents, men like the Norwegian immigrant Henry Bergstrom, a logger who had weathered winters inside the Arctic Circle, confessed that this season was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The central point of the community was Main Street, a quagmire in the summer but a desolate frozen strip in the winter, flanked by Jeremiah Prescott's General Store, a 2-story wooden structure that functioned as the town's primary supply depot and unofficial information exchange. Prescott, a cunning merchant who had moved from Connecticut in 1839, kept fastidious records of every transaction and every bit of gossip that passed through his establishment. His detailed ledgers would later become vital evidence in grasping the full scope of Samuel Hawthorne's influence over the community. The Milbrook Inn, managed by the widow Abigail Foresk, whose husband had been killed in a logging accident 3 years earlier, stood at the eastern end of Main Street. Mrs. Foresk maintained rooms for the infrequent travelers who became stranded in Milbrook during their passage through the mountains. Her inn also functioned as the town's informal social hub where farmers and loggers congregated on winter evenings to consume corn whiskey, play cards, and share news from the distant world. Dominating the town square was a modest white church, where Reverend Isaiah Greenfield delivered sermons to progressively smaller congregations. Greenfield, a strict Congregationalist minister and graduate of Yale, had arrived in Milbrook in 1844 with the ambition of cultivating a robust Christian community in the wilderness. By the winter of 1847, however, his congregation was battling profound doubts that ran much deeper than the typical challenges of frontier existence. The brutal demands of survival in such a secluded location were severely testing everyone's fundamental faith in divine providence. Most families inhabited modest wooden homes, heated by whatever firewood they managed to gather before the heavy. Snowfalls rendered the surrounding forests impassable. The more financially secure residents, such as Thomas and Grace Thornberry, who owned the largest farm in the valley and provided employment to several local men as seasonal laborers, lived in two-story houses featuring multiple fireplaces and cellars for storing preserved foodstuffs. The Thornberrys had 3 children: Sarah, 12, who was already contributing to household duties; Mary, 8, renowned for her vibrant curiosity about the world; and young William, only 5 years old and his mother's cherished child. By February of 1847, Milbrook was struggling under burdens that exceeded the usual rigors of a harsh winter. The community had already lost 5 residents to the combined effects of cold and illness. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger, had been found frozen in his cabin after the chimney collapsed during a January blizzard, and had been beloved by the children for his tales of northern lights and trolls. Margaret Fairchild's infant had died from pneumonia, despite Dr. Putnam's best efforts, leaving the young mother submerged in a state of grief so profound that she rarely spoke to anyone. Most critically, the town faced a severe depletion of food and medical supplies. The final delivery wagons had arrived in late November, and no one anticipated any resupply until the spring thaw made the mountain passes accessible again. Dr. Putnam's medical resources were nearly exhausted. He was down to his last few bottles of laudanum and quinine, and the signs of wear on his surgical instruments made him increasingly anxious about attempting even routine procedures. The entire stage was tragically set for the horrifying appearance of Samuel Hawthorne. People began whispering that a cursed winter had settled over their tiny community like a suffocating burial shroud, and some of the older residents spoke in hushed, fearful tones about their intention to completely abandon Milbrook once spring arrived. It was into this bleak, isolated, and desperate environment that Samuel Hawthorne suddenly emerged from the raging storm, bringing with him specialized knowledge and vital supplies that seemed suspiciously fortuitous. As the townspeople would soon realize, their suspicions were entirely justified. February 18, 1847. That date is permanently etched into the memory of every surviving family in Milbrook, meticulously documented not only in Dr. Putnam's medical journals, but also in the personal diaries of at least 6 residents who recorded the bizarre sequence of events that began that night. Young Timothy Prescott, Jeremiah's 14-year-old son, was the first to detect the figure stumbling down the mountain trail in the heart of a blizzard that had already deposited 3 feet of fresh snow in the valley since daybreak. The boy was checking the back windows of the store for ice damage when he saw what appeared to be a walking corpse, a stark silhouette against the blinding fury of the storm. Timothy's initial reaction was to dismiss the figure as a simple hallucination brought on by staring too long into the swirling snow. Yet, as he continued to watch, the shape resolved itself into an unmistakably human form. The figure moved with distinct purpose, following the convoluted path down from the high peaks with a level of certainty that seemed impossible in such treacherous conditions. Most travelers caught in blizzards would wander aimlessly, becoming increasingly disoriented until succumbing to exhaustion or exposure. This person, however, walked as if he were guided by a map visible only to him. The boy alerted his father, and within minutes, nearly half the men in town had assembled at Prescott's store to witness the stranger's approach. What they observed defied their comprehension of what was humanly possible in such severe weather. The figure stood upright and advanced against winds forceful enough to bend trees almost horizontal. His pace was measured and steady, unhurried, as though he were taking a leisurely walk on a pleasant day instead of battling conditions that had already claimed several lives that winter. Samuel Hawthorne arrived seemingly at death's very threshold. His attire was notably peculiar, fabricated from materials entirely unfamiliar to the people of Milbrook. His outermost garment appeared to be a long cloak or coat crafted from what resembled specially treated animal hide, yet the texture was unlike any leather the local hunters and farmers recognized. It was notably thick, almost armor-like in its look, and seemed to actively shed the snow rather than absorb it. Beneath this, he wore what appeared to be layered clothing constructed from a tightly interwoven fabric that caught the light in a manner that suggested it was almost metallic. His boots were perhaps the most perplexing aspect of his appearance. They were built in such a way that they left strange imprints in snow, deeper than ordinary boots would make, with a distinctive pattern that included what looked like metallic studs or spikes arranged in geometric formations. Dr. Putnam later meticulously sketched these tracks in his journal, noting they were unlike any footwear manufactured in New England or any European pattern with which I am familiar. The boots appeared to be purpose-built for traversing difficult terrain in extreme cold, suggesting a level of specialized knowledge and superior craftsmanship that felt inconsistent with Hawthorne's claim of originating from a simple mountain community. However, it was Hawthorne's physical state that first truly disturbed the townspeople. Despite having allegedly wandered through a deadly blizzard for what he claimed were many days and nights of walking to the White Death, he exhibited none of the expected signs of severe frostbite that should have destroyed his fingers and toes. His cheeks were flushed with cold, certainly, but his extremities were perfectly intact. His movements were fluid and well-coordinated, and his speech was clear and entirely articulate. Dr. Putnam thoroughly examined him and found this condition so extraordinary that he wrote extensively about it, speculating that Hawthorne must have had access to shelter and suitable provisions. Far more recently than his narrative implied, the man himself was notably tall and slender, standing well over 6 feet, with dark hair that streaks of premature white, although he appeared to be no older than 35. His physique suggested someone well accustomed to arduous physical labor and harsh environmental conditions. His hands were heavily calloused and scarred, his shoulders broad from years of carrying heavy loads, and his legs powerfully developed from traversing long distances over difficult landscapes. But it was his face that most clearly stood out in people's memories. His features were sharp and angular, with prominent cheekbones and a distinct nose that gave him an almost predatory look. His skin was weathered but healthy, lacking the pallor or indicators of malnutrition one would anticipate from someone surviving in the wilderness. Most unforgettable were his eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in certain lighting, resembling ice covering deep water. The way he observed people made them profoundly uneasy, as if he were coldly assessing them for some purpose they could not comprehend. Children were drawn to him with the same intense fascination they might show toward a dangerous, caged animal, while adults instinctively felt a need to maintain their distance. Several residents later described the unsettling feeling that Hawthorne was methodically cataloging everything he observed, memorizing the physical layout of their homes, the routines of their families, and the established social hierarchies and relationships within the community. When he finally spoke, it was in immaculate English, but with an accent that no one in Milbrook could place. It was not British, despite some phonetic similarities. It was not German or Scandinavian, though faint influences of those sounds were present. Dr. Putnam, who had traveled widely before settling in Vermont, describe it as an accent that seems to borrow from many sources while belonging to none. Hawthorne's vocabulary was vast and precise, hinting at a formal education, yet he occasionally used words or phrases that sounded archaic or simply unfamiliar to his listeners. His account, when he eventually shared it, was simultaneously compelling and deeply disturbing. He asserted that he came from beyond the Great Peaks, from valleys where the sun shines differently and the seasons follow older patterns. When pressed with specific details about this supposed homeland, he grew evasive, speaking only of my people and the homeland across the white fields, where the old ways still guide the wise. He described a community that existed in complete harmony with the most brutal aspects of nature, where survival depended not on actively combating the wilderness, but on fully understanding its profound rhythms and accepting its necessary cruelties. The children, captivated, gathered around whenever he spoke, eager to hear his stories of distant places and strange, ancient customs. Adults felt a profound sense of unease around him, yet they struggled to articulate the exact reason why this was so. There was an elusive quality about his movements, the meticulous manner in which he registered every detail of his surroundings, and the way his pale eyes seemed to look straight through people rather than merely at them, triggering deep, primal alarm responses in anyone who spent more than a few minutes near him. The most disturbing element of Samuel Hawthorne's presence, however, was the contents of his inseparable companion. Inside a leather satchel, crafted from the same strange, weather-defying material as his coat, he guarded what he vaguely referred to as his medicines and tools of survival. The actual contents of this bag would eventually become the foundation of the town's most terrifying nightmares. But in those initial days, yearning for any form of assistance, the people of Milbrook welcomed what felt like a miraculous, divine intervention in their bleakest hour. On that first night, as Hawthorne took warmth by the fire in the Milbrook Inn, sipping a mug of Mrs. Forrest's strongest coffee, he began to demonstrate the expertise that would quickly make him indispensable to the community. When young Sarah Thornberry started coughing violently, a symptom that had worsened throughout the week and had Dr. Putnam concerned about consumption, Hawthorne listened intently to the sound and immediately identified the cause as a respiratory infection brought on by inhaling too much smoke from the poorly ventilated fireplaces. From his mysterious satchel, he withdrew a small vial containing a dark, oily liquid that smelled distinctly of pine needles and something else, something sweet and organic that no one could pinpoint. He instructed Sarah to consume just 3 drops mixed into warm water right before retiring for the night. Within 60 minutes, her coughing had significantly diminished, and by the following morning, she was breathing normally for the first time in weeks. News of this astounding cure spread through Milbrook with incredible speed, and by the close of Samuel Hawthorne's first full day in town, nearly half the community was queuing outside the inn, pleading for relief from the various persistent ailments that had plagued them all winter long. Within a matter of days following his arrival, Samuel Hawthorne had firmly established himself as Milbrook's unofficial second physician, though his methods bore no resemblance to anything the townspeople had ever witnessed. Dr. Putnam, initially dismissive of anyone claiming medical knowledge without formal training, developed a grudging respect for the stranger's diagnostic precision and the undeniable effectiveness of his treatments. Hawthorne possessed an uncanny ability to diagnose illnesses with a single glance, identifying conditions that had baffled Putnam for weeks. He inexplicably knew precisely which herbs to forage for, even in the deepest winter, somehow locating medicinal plants buried beneath several feet of snow. Most remarkably, his cures worked with an efficiency that bordered on the truly miraculous. When little Sarah Thornberry developed what Dr. Putnam feared with consumption, the very disease that had claimed 3 lives in Milbrook the previous winter, Hawthorne prepared a strange concoction that involved boiling specific roots with what he claimed was preserved meat from mountain game, prepared according to the old traditions of my people. The preparation process consumed several hours and demanded ingredients that Hawthorne produced from various containers within his seemingly inexhaustible leather satchel. The aroma that permeated the inn from his cooking pot was unlike anything the residents had ever smelled. Sweet and cloying, with sickly undertone that reminded several people of the time Henrik Bergstrom's body was not found for nearly a week after his cabin chimney collapsed. Mrs. Foresk, who took great pride in her knowledge of cooking and food preservation, could not identify any of the scents emanating from Hawthorne's preparation. When she inquired about his ingredients, he offered a cryptic smile and explained that my people had developed these preservation techniques over countless generations of survival in the harshest mountain environments. The medicine worked. Sarah experienced a complete recovery within 3 days, though she later complained of vivid, terrifying nightmares filled with endless snow and hungry, watchful eyes observing her from dark places. She described dreaming of walking through vast white landscapes where shadowy figures called out to her in unrecognizable languages, promising her warmth and sustenance if only she would participate in their sacred feast. Her mother, Grace Thornberry, was so overwhelmingly grateful for her daughter's recovery that she insisted Hawthorne stay in the family's spare room above the kitchen, despite her husband Thomas's strong reservations about hosting a complete stranger about whom they knew so very little. It was Grace who first noticed Hawthorne's peculiar habits and began documenting them in letters addressed to her sister in Albany, letters that were ultimately never sent, but were preserved within the Thornberry family papers, providing crucial evidence for later investigators. Hawthorne never slept for more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, and always with one ear seemingly cocked, as if constantly anticipating something to track him down. He would awaken multiple times throughout the night and spend long periods sitting absolutely motionless by the window, staring out the snow-covered landscape with unsettling intensity that made Grace deeply uncomfortable. He would vanish for hours, even during the most severe storms, claiming he needed to collect specific plants and materials for his medicines. These excursions seemed utterly impossible given the brutal weather conditions, winds that made it dangerous for even experienced outdoorsmen to venture far from shelter, and temperatures that could kill an unprotected person within hours. Yet, Hawthorne would invariably return from these mysterious journeys with his strange boots barely damp and carrying items that simply should not have been available in the Vermont wilderness during the heart of winter. Fresh meat was the most puzzling of his acquisitions. While local hunters had seen no game for weeks and were relying solely on preserved stores from the autumn hunt, Hawthorne regularly came back with what he claimed were rabbits, deer, and other forest animals he had either trapped or hunted during his ventures. The meat always looked incredibly fresh and was expertly prepared, cut into precise portions that he claimed were traditional methods passed down by his people. However, several of the most experienced hunters in the town noticed that the cuts did not look quite right. The bone structure seemed wrong for the animals Hawthorne claimed the meat came from, and the meat itself possessed a distinct texture and color that did not match their knowledge of local game. Dr. Putnam, whose medical training included some study of anatomy, grew increasingly suspicious of Hawthorne's mysterious game meat. During one of his closer examinations of the portions Hawthorne utilized in his medicinal preparations, Putnam observed what appeared to be cuts of meat that looked startlingly similar to human muscle tissue. When he raised his concern with Hawthorne, the stranger laughed and explained that his people had developed techniques for preparing meat that could make even the toughest animals tender and nutritious. "You must understand, Doctor," Hawthorne said with his unsettling smile, "that survival in the true wilderness requires one to abandon the squeamish attitudes of civilized society. My people learned long ago that all meat is essentially the same. It provides the nutrients needed to sustain life regardless of its original source. The important thing is proper preparation and the spiritual attitude with which one consumes what nature provides." Grace found him one morning carefully cleaning what appeared to be a woman's silver locket, polishing it with soft cloth while humming a tune she'd never heard, but which seemed hauntingly familiar. The melody was simple but deeply unsettling, with a rhythm that reminded her of funeral dirges she'd heard as a child. When she asked about the locket, he smiled that unsettling smile and said, "It belonged to a dear friend from home who couldn't make the journey, but whose spirit travels with me always." But Grace could have sworn she'd seen that exact locket before around the neck of Rebecca Henley, the wife of merchant James Henley, who had disappeared with her husband during a trip to Albany the previous autumn. The Henleys had been traveling through the mountain passes when an early storm trapped them, and despite extensive searches by local authorities, no trace of them had ever been found. The locket was distinctive, silver, with an intricate floral pattern that Rebecca's grandmother had brought from Ireland. Grace had admired it many times when the Henleys visited Milbrook for supplies. The stranger's room became a source of growing unease for the Thornberry family. Strange sounds emanated from it. At night, soft scraping noises like someone working with small tools, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like muffled crying or whimpering. The sounds were so faint that they might have been dismissed as settling wood or wind through the walls, but they followed patterns that suggested deliberate activity rather than natural phenomena. When Grace's husband, Thomas, finally worked up the courage to ask about the sounds, Hawthorne explained he was working on maps to guide me back home when spring arrives and journals to record the wisdom I've learned during my time among your people. He showed Thomas elaborate drawings on what looked like treated animal hide marked with symbols and route notations that made no sense to anyone in Milbrook. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing topographical features, weather patterns, and travel routes through terrain that seemed far more extensive than anything visible from Milbrook. But the maps told a disturbing story for anyone who looked closely enough to understand their implications. They detailed every path through surrounding mountains, every cave and shelter, every place where a person might take refuge during a storm. More troubling still, they included notations in a language none of the town's people could read, marking certain locations with symbols that looked disturbingly like tally marks. Some areas were marked with what appeared to be numbers, suggesting that Hawthorne was keeping count of something or someone. Dr. Putnam, whose curiosity about Hawthorne's methods had evolved into genuine suspicion, began keeping his own detailed notes about his colleagues' behavior and the effects of his treatments on the townspeople. What he documented would later become crucial evidence in understanding the true nature of what was happening in Milbrook. The first disturbing pattern Putnam noticed was in the way Hawthorne's patients responded to his treatments. While the immediate effects were invariably positive, symptoms disappeared, strength returned, overall health improved dramatically. There were subtle changes in behavior that became apparent over time. Patients who had been treated by Hawthorne began to crave meat with an intensity that seemed unusual, especially given the limited protein available during the harsh winter. They also displayed increased aggression and territorial behavior, becoming protective of their food stores in ways that went beyond normal wartime rationing instincts. More troubling were the psychological changes. Several of Hawthorne's patients began experiencing similar nightmares, dreams of walking through snowy landscapes populated by shadowy figures who offered them sustenance in exchange for joining their eternal feast. These dreams were so vivid and consistent across multiple patients that Putnam began to suspect some form of shared psychological influence, possibly through ingredients in Hawthorne's medicines that affected brain function. The breaking point in Dr. Putnam's growing suspicions came when he decided to analyze one of Hawthorne's medicine preparations using techniques he had learned during his medical training in Boston. Using a microscope he kept for examining tissue samples, Putnam discovered what appeared to be human hair and bone fragments in a powder that Hawthorne claimed was made from ground antler and medicinal roots. When confronted with this evidence, Hawthorne's reaction was swift and chilling. Rather than denying the findings or expressing surprise, he seemed pleased that Putnam had been observant enough to make the discovery. "Ah, doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes gleaming with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "I had hoped someone in this community would possess the intelligence to understand the true nature of my work. Yes, you are correct in your analysis. The most effective medicines are those that incorporate elements from the ultimate source of life, human beings themselves." Putnam's blood ran cold as Hawthorne continued his explanation. "In my homeland, we learned long ago that the human body contains within it all the elements necessary to heal and strengthen other human bodies. When prepared properly, according to the sacred traditions passed down through generations of true healers, human tissue becomes the most powerful medicine available. It creates a bond between those who share in its consumption, a communion that goes far deeper than anything your Christian sacraments could achieve." The implications of what Hawthorne was describing hit Putnam like a physical blow. Not only was this man feeding human remains to the townspeople's medicine, but he was doing so as part of a deliberate plan to psychologically condition them to accept cannibalism as normal and even beneficial. The nightmares, the behavioral changes, the craving for meat, all of it was part of a systematic process of breaking down the psychological barriers that prevented civilized people from engaging in the ultimate taboo. As February melted into March, the situation in Milbrook took an increasingly dark and complex turn. Samuel Hawthorne's medical successes continued to mount, but so did the strange incidents and unsettling discoveries surrounding his presence. Dr. Putnam began keeping detailed notes about his mysterious colleague's methods, partly out of medical curiosity and increasingly due to a growing suspicion that something profoundly disturbing was happening to his community under the guise of healing. Hawthorne's medical kit contained instruments that Dr. Putnam had never encountered in any surgical manual or medical textbook. There were scalpels with peculiar curved blades designed for cutting in ways that seemed more suited to butchery than delicate surgery. Small saws possessed teeth arranged in patterns that suggested they were intended for cutting through thick bone rather than performing precise operations, and various vials contained powders and liquids that emitted odors unlike any known pharmaceutical preparations. When Putnam asked for permission to examine these substances more closely, hoping to understand their composition, and potentially learn new techniques for his own patients, Hawthorne skillfully deflected the request with elaborate explanations about family secrets passed down through generations of healers in the old country, and sacred knowledge that loses its potency when shared with those who haven't been properly initiated into its mysteries. The definitive breakthrough in understanding Hawthorne's true nature arrived when young Timothy Prescott, the same boy who had first spotted the stranger emerging from the blizzard, made a discovery that would fundamentally change everything the townspeople thought they knew about their mysterious benefactor. While exploring the woods directly behind the Thornberry house, Timothy found what he initially thought was an animal's den, or perhaps a cave-in from an old mine shaft. The opening was cleverly concealed by a pile of fallen logs and accumulated snow, making it virtually invisible unless one was looking directly at it from a specific angle. But as Timothy investigated closer, clearing away some of the debris to gauge the depth of the depression, he realized that someone had been actively using the cave-like space as a meticulously organized storage site. The opening led into a natural chamber in the hillside that had been expanded and modified to create a sophisticated cache for preserving supplies and materials. The chamber walls were lined with what appeared to be treated animal hides, yet the texture and appearance were distinct from anything local hunters produced. Inside this hidden repository, carefully wrapped in the same strange leather-like material as Hawthorne's clothing, were objects that sent a chill through Timothy, causing his hands to tremble as he unwrapped bundle after bundle of evidence pointing to something far more sinister than anyone in Milbrook had ever conceived. There were clothes, a great number of them, men's work shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, all preserved and carefully folded, but damaged in ways that suggested they had been violently cut away from their owners rather than simply discarded or outgrown. Some bore dark stains that Timothy, despite his young age, instantly recognized as blood. The clothing represented styles and fabrics from different regions and time periods, suggesting that this gruesome collection had been assembled over a period of several years from numerous distinct sources. More disturbing were the personal items: wedding rings, pocket watches, women's jewelry, children's toys, family photographs, religious objects like crosses and prayer books, and dozens of other small items that families treasure and would never willingly abandon. Each item was carefully cleaned and methodically organized, as if they were trophies being preserved for some specific, unknown purpose. But what truly terrified Timothy was a collection of detailed sketches he discovered, wrapped in oilcloth to shield them from moisture. They were anatomical drawings depicting the human body in ways that seemed specifically designed for butchery rather than healing. The drawings included meticulous notations about optimal cutting points for maximum yield, preservation methods for extended storage in winter conditions, and preparation techniques for various forms of consumption. Some sketches illustrated techniques for breaking down large game animals, deer, elk, bear, with detailed instructions for field dressing and meat preservation, but others clearly depicted human forms with identical notations, treating the human body as simply another source of protein to be harvested and processed. The clinical precision of these drawings, combined with their obvious practical application, strongly suggested that their creator possessed extensive hands-on experience with the horrific procedures they illustrated. Timothy ran home and immediately told his father, Jeremiah Prescott, who initially dismissed the boy's story as a fever-induced delusion brought on by too many ghost stories told around the fire. But Jeremiah Prescott was a sensible man who had learned to trust his son's powers of observation. When Timothy led him to the cache, even Jeremiah could not rationalize away what they discovered. The most chilling find was a journal written in the same careful handwriting that had created Hawthorne's maps. The entries were dated, going back over 3 years, describing what the author called expeditions into the mountains and encounters with traveling parties and isolated families. The journal documented these encounters with a chilling, clinical detachment, detailing the author's increasing expertise in the field preservation of resources and maintaining supplies during extended periods of isolation. As Jeremiah read through the entries, a horrifying pattern emerged. The journal described a systematic process of stalking and trapping travelers, particularly small groups or families who were vulnerable to the harsh mountain conditions. The author had developed sophisticated techniques for approaching potential victims under the guise of offering assistance, only to isolate them in remote locations where they could be killed and processed without any risk of discovery. One entry, dated nearly 18 months before Hawthorne's arrival in Milbrook, described an encounter with a family of 5 traveling to Albany for the father's work as a mill supervisor. The journal detailed how the author had offered to guide them through a mountain pass that would supposedly save them several days of travel, only to lead them directly into a trap during a fierce storm. What followed was described with the emotionless precision of a medical procedure, detailing how each family member had been killed and their bodies processed for meat and other useful materials. The journal shockingly revealed that this was not random violence or simple murder for robbery. It was a calculated, horrifying system for obtaining human flesh for consumption and for use in the medicines that Hawthorne had been administering to the desperate people of Milbrook. The author described human meat as the most complete and nutritionally dense protein available, detailing various elaborate methods for its preservation and preparation for both immediate consumption and long-term storage. Most disturbing of all were the journal entries documenting the profound psychological effects of consuming human flesh, both on the author himself and on others who had been systematically introduced to practice. The journal meticulously outlined a calculated, step-by-step process for dismantling the normal human revulsion to cannibalism through gradual conditioning. This began with minute amounts mixed into other foods and medicines, then systematically increased in proportion until the subject was consuming pure human tissue without even realizing it. The journal further described how this conditioning process induced specific psychological changes, making the subjects far more vulnerable to suggestion and increasingly willing to participate in activities they would normally find utterly abhorrent. The author had clearly used this precise technique to cultivate accomplices in previous communities, effectively converting ordinary, decent people into willing participants in his ongoing cannibalistic practices. As Jeremiah finished reading the most recent entries, he realized with a paralyzing horror that everything described in the journal was actively being implemented right now in Milbrook. Hawthorne wasn't merely feeding the townspeople human flesh. He was systematically and deliberately converting them into a community of cannibals who would eventually become willing partners in a continuous campaign of murder and consumption. Armed with this horrifying, irrefutable evidence, Jeremiah Prescott faced an impossible moral and practical decision that he knew would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The man who had unequivocally saved his neighbors' lives, who had successfully pulled Milbrook back from the brink of disaster during the most brutal winter in living memory, was demonstrably something far more monstrous than anyone had dared to imagine. But how could he possibly accuse the town's acknowledged savior of being a serial killer and cannibal? especially when many people were still gratefully recovering from the very illnesses he had cured, and when his treatments continued to keep the community healthy despite the ongoing, relentlessly harsh conditions. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet Prescott realized that simply presenting the journal and sketches to the townspeople might not be sufficient to convince them. Hawthorne had cultivated an enormous reservoir of goodwill and trust within the community. People revered him as a miracle worker, a man sent by divine providence to rescue them in their darkest hour. They might easily dismiss the evidence as a malicious fabrication or a gross misinterpretation, particularly if Hawthorne offered his own convincing alternative explanations. Prescott wisely decided to first confide in Dr. Putnam, desperately hoping the educated physician could help him understand the true nature of what they were dealing with and develop a secure strategy for exposing Hawthorne without causing mass panic or allowing him to escape justice before he could be apprehended. Putnam's reaction was immediate and visceral. He had been harboring his own deep suspicions about Hawthorne's methods for weeks, and Prescott's horrifying discovery instantly confirmed his worst fears about the true composition of the medicines that had proven so remarkably effective in treating the townspeople's ailments. Together, they immediately began a more systematic and covert investigation into Hawthorne's activities and influence within the community. Putnam started asking Hawthorne more probing and pointed questions about his medical training, pressing hard for specific details about where he had acquired his unusual techniques and which medical authorities had validated his methods. Hawthorne's replies were consistently vague, filled with obscure references to master healers in distant lands and ancient knowledge passed down through sacred traditions that outsiders simply couldn't comprehend without proper spiritual preparation. When Putnam cautiously suggested they collaborate to thoroughly document Hawthorne's techniques for the benefit of other medical researchers and doctors, potentially publishing their findings in medical journals to spread these beneficial treatments to communities throughout New England, the stranger became visibly agitated. He adamantly insisted that his methods were strictly not meant for outside eyes, and that sharing them with those who hadn't been properly initiated into their deeper meanings would immediately strip them of their healing power and potentially cause profound harm. Meanwhile, Prescott quietly began researching the numerous disappearances that had occurred in the surrounding region over the past several years, utilizing his connections with merchants and suppliers who regularly traveled the perilous mountain roads to gather intelligence about missing persons and unsolved crimes. What he uncovered painted a truly terrifying and systematic pattern that stretched far beyond anything he had initially suspected. Families traveling through the mountain passes had vanished with an alarming frequency over the past 4 years. Hunting parties had failed to return from expeditions that should have been routine. Lone travelers had simply disappeared into the wilderness, occasionally leaving behind only abandoned wagons or campsites that appeared to have been hastily vacated. In every single case, the disappearances had occurred during the brutal winter months when the harsh weather made extensive searches utterly impossible and when bodies might not be discovered until the spring thaw, if ever. The most chilling revelation came when Prescott found records of similar incidents stretching back over 7 years, following a clear trail that seemed to move systematically through different regions of Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. Each area would endure a period of mysterious disappearances lasting 2 to 3 years, followed by reports of helpful strangers who opportunistically appeared during times of community crisis, someone with medical knowledge and survival skills that seemed almost too convenient to be purely coincidental. In the mountain town of Grafton, Vermont in 1844, a mysterious healer named Samuel Hawthorne had appeared during a diphtheria outbreak, saving dozens of lives before vanishing in the spring along with several families who had supposedly decided to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In North Conway, New Hampshire, during the harsh winter of 1845, a man calling himself Samuel Blackthorne had provided crucial assistance during a severe food shortage, only to disappear when local investigators began asking too many pointed questions about his background and methods. The pattern was shockingly identical in every location: an arrival during a crisis, the swift establishment of trust through effective medical treatment, the gradual introduction of strange practices and medicines, and eventually either the conversion of the entire community to his twisted, cannibalistic philosophy or the elimination of key witnesses, followed by a systematic relocation to a new hunting ground. Dr. Putnam made his own disturbing discovery while conducting a final, more thorough chemical examination of some of Hawthorne's preserved medicines. Using advanced chemical tests he had learned during his extensive medical training, Putnam confirmed his absolute worst suspicions about the true composition of these miraculous treatments. The medicines contained not just human tissue, but tissue originating from multiple individuals, strongly suggesting that Hawthorne had access to a large, long-term supply of human remains that he was systematically processing and utilizing for various dark purposes. Even more horrifying was Putnam's definitive realization that the medicines were intentionally engineered to be psychologically addictive. Chemical analysis revealed specific compounds that drastically affected brain function, compelling patients to crave continued treatment, while simultaneously making them increasingly susceptible to psychological manipulation. The miraculous recoveries were not solely the result of effective medicine. They were the calculated product of a sophisticated system of chemical conditioning that simultaneously made patients utterly dependent on their healer and systematically broke down their moral resistance to progressively disturbing practices. When Dr. Putnam finally attempted to confront Hawthorne with these findings, the man's reaction was terrifying in its casual, absolute honesty. Rather than denying the serious accusations or feigning outrage at the damning implications, Hawthorne seemed almost relieved that someone had finally grasped the true sophistication of his work. "You simply don't understand the necessities of true survival, Doctor," Hawthorne stated, his pale eyes acquiring a predatory gleam that sent a deep chill through Putnam. "In the places I've been, in the desperate situations I've faced, one quickly learns that the boundaries between medicine and other necessities become meaningless when mere survival is at stake. The human body readily provides what the human body needs, if one possesses the necessary knowledge and the sheer will to use it properly." Hawthorne continued his chilling explanation with the calm, academic precision of a professor delivering a lecture to eager students. "Your civilized society has created artificial taboos around the most natural and efficient forms of sustenance. My people learned countless generations ago that these taboos are a luxury attitude that only the weak and the well-fed can afford to maintain. When winter comes, when food reserves vanish, when death stalks every single household, such squeamishness becomes not just foolish, but actively harmful to survival." Putnam left that conversation utterly convinced that Samuel Hawthorne was not merely a killer. He was something far worse. He was a cannibal who perfected his monstrous methods over years of extensive practice, using specialized medical knowledge to systematically justify and refine his horrific activities, while simultaneously developing techniques for converting entire communities to his perverse worldview. The situation in Milbrook began to escalate with alarming rapidity as more townspeople started displaying the severe behavioral changes that Putnam had previously only observed in Hawthorne's immediate patients. The intense craving for meat became sharply more pronounced, with several families reporting that their members would wake up in the middle of the night to consume whatever protein they could locate, often eating it raw. Children began engaging in increasingly violent and disturbing games that involved detailed discussions of butchering and food preparation. Adults started compulsively hoarding personal items taken from deceased community members, claiming they were keeping their spirits close, yet displaying possessive behaviors that seemed far more predatory than sentimental. Most disturbing was the way the townspeople began to regard any outsiders or potential visitors with a palpable, suspicious calculation. When a lost traveler stumbled into Milbrook during a fierce March snowstorm, several residents gathered to observe the stranger with expressions that Dr. Putnam vividly described in his journal as the look of hungry wolves evaluating potential prey. The definitive breaking point came when Grace Thornberry's youngest daughter, Mary, began exhibiting symptoms that made it terrifyingly clear just how deeply Hawthorne's influence had penetrated community. The 8-year-old child developed an insatiable, overwhelming hunger for meat, specifically raw meat, and began having vivid, nightmarish visions about the hungry people in the snow who wanted to share their feast with her and teach her the old ways of eating. Grace found Mary in the cellar at midnight, vigorously gnawing on a raw piece of salted pork with an expression of pure animalistic hunger, her small hands and face smeared with blood and grease. When her mother instinctively tried to take the meat away, Mary growled, literally growled like a wild animal, and bared her teeth as if preparing to viciously bite anyone who came between her and her food. The child's eyes held the same pale, predatory gleam they had all learned to recognize in Samuel Hawthorne. And when she spoke, her voice carried the exact unsettling cadence and specialized vocabulary that distinctly marked all of Hawthorne's converts. "The teacher says we must learn to eat what the mountain provides," Mary stated, deliberately licking her bloody fingers with obvious pleasure. "He says the old people were wrong to waste so much good food just because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. He says when we learn the right way to eat, we'll never be hungry again, and we'll never have to fear the winter." Grace realized with agonizing, dawning horror that her own daughter had been systematically conditioned to accept cannibalism as not only acceptable but desirable, and that this appalling conditioning was actively spreading throughout the entire community under the deceitful guise of medical treatment and survival education. That very same night, Thomas Thornberry discovered Samuel Hawthorne in the family's barn, diligently working by the light of a single candle over what appeared to be a large piece of meat spread across the workbench typically used for processing their livestock. But as Thomas forced himself to look more closely, he realized with sickening certainty that what Hawthorne was carefully cutting and preparing was not any animal that belonged to the Thornberry farm. The meat was pale and possessed a fine texture, with a bone structure that was undeniably, terrifyingly human. Hawthorne was working with practiced, chilling efficiency, his strange, customized surgical tools gleaming in the candlelight as he separated different cuts and meticulously wrapped them in treated cloth for preservation. Arranged around him were various containers holding what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all meticulously labeled with symbols that perfectly matched those in his mysterious journal. When Hawthorne noticed Thomas silently watching him, he showed no discernible sign of shame, surprise, or alarm. Instead, he simply smiled that unsettling smile and gestured for Thomas to come closer, as it graciously invited him to observe a fascinating demonstration of useful, practical skills. "Ah, Thomas," Hawthorne said in his calm, measured voice. "Perfect timing. I was sincerely hoping someone in the family would eventually take an interest in learning these essential techniques. Your children are showing such remarkable progress in accepting the new ways. It would be highly beneficial for you to understand the practical aspects of what we're doing here." Thomas stood absolutely frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the horrifying sight and sounds assaulting his senses. Hawthorne calmly continued his work, explaining his methods with a casual tone of someone discussing ordinary farm chores. "This came from the traveler who passed through last week," Hawthorne said, indicating the meat he was diligently processing. "Poor fellow was already dying from exposure when I found him in the woods. Rather than let such valuable resources go to waste, I've been preserving what can be used for the community's benefit. The medicine I prepared for your daughter Mary included portions of this tissue. That's why her recovery from winter sickness was so remarkably complete." The full implications of Hawthorne's words hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. Not only was this man butchering human corpses for food and medicine, but he had been systematically feeding human flesh to Thomas's own children under the deceitful guise of effective medical treatment. "You're feeding my family human beings," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with disbelief. "I'm feeding your family the most nutritious and spiritually powerful sustenance available," Hawthorne corrected him calmly. "In my homeland, we understand that the consumption of human flesh forges bonds between people that go far deeper than ordinary social relationships. Those who share in the sacred feast become part of an eternal community that transcends the ordinary boundaries of life and death." Hawthorne then deliberately set down his tools and turned to face Thomas directly, his pale eyes gleaming with a terrifying, evangelical fervor. "Your family is being transformed, Thomas. Your children are being prepared for a life where they will never again fear hunger, cold, or isolation. They are learning to see the world as it truly is, a place where the strong survive by consuming the weak, where waste is the only sin, and where every death provides the opportunity for continued life. Just when we thought the horror in Milbrook couldn't possibly intensify, it escalated far beyond anything the townspeople could have possibly imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because what Thomas Thornberry witnessed in his own barn was only the beginning of Samuel Hawthorne's final, terrifying revelation. The devastating confrontation that would ultimately determine Milbrook's fate occurred on March 15th, 1847, during what will forever be remembered as the bloodiest night in the town's entire history. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott had spent the whole previous day gathering irrefutable evidence and necessary allies, finally managing to convince Reverend Greenfield and several other key town leaders that Samuel Hawthorne posed an existential, mortal threat to their community. The decision to act immediately had been forced by increasingly desperate and frightening circumstances. More townspeople were exhibiting undeniable signs of advanced psychological conditioning. Children were inexplicably disappearing for hours at a time and returning with blood stains on their clothes and secretive, knowing expressions, and several families reported finding disturbing human remains hidden in their cellars and barns. The carefully laid plan was to quietly apprehend Hawthorne and search his belongings for concrete evidence that could be presented to federal authorities. But Hawthorne had been watching the community's leaders just as meticulously as they had been watching him. When the group of 6 men, Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornberry, innkeeper Joshua Foresk, Abigail's brother-in-law, who had arrived from Bennington the week before, and town constable Marcus Hartwell, approached the Thornberry house that evening, they found the scene transformed into something straight out of their worst nightmares. The house was eerily silent, yet candlelight flickered from every single window, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a deliberate, unnatural purpose. It was far too quiet for a household that should contain a family of 5 plus their mysterious guest. The profound silence was broken only by a low, rhythmic sound that none of them could immediately identify. Something between singing and chanting, with a disturbing cadence that seemed to unerringly match the slow, steady beat of a human heart. Thomas Thornberry met them at the door, but the man who greeted them was no longer the hard-working farmer they had known for years. Something was fundamentally wrong with his eyes. They held the same vacant, intensely predatory expression they had all learned to recognize in Hawthorne's most devoted followers, but intensified to a degree that made him seem barely human. His movements were fluid and unerringly coordinated, like a predator stalking prey, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed somehow sharper than they should have been. Behind him, Grace Thornberry stood motionless in the hallway, her hands stained with what looked unmistakably like blood, her once neat dress torn and visibly stained with substances that the men instinctively did not want to identify. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face wore an expression of beatific calm that was somehow more terrifying than outright madness would have been. "Samuel has been teaching us about true survival," Thomas said in a voice that did not quite sound like his own. The words carried Hawthorne's distinctive accent and cadence, as if Thomas was reciting meticulously memorized lessons about the communion that binds communities together in the deepest winter and the sacred responsibilities that come with understanding the real nature of sustenance. "Would you like to learn?" Dr. Putnam pushed past Thomas, his medical training instantly overriding his raw fear as he desperately tried to understand what profound horror had befallen the Thornberry family. What he found inside the house was a scene that would mentally scar him for the rest of his life. A nightmare that combined grotesque religious ritual and methodical butchery in ways that fundamentally challenged his understanding of what human beings were truly capable of becoming. The furniture had been rearranged to create what looked like a primitive altar in the center of the main living room. The Thornberrys' dining table had been moved to serve as the focal point, surrounded by chairs arranged in a perfect, rigid circle. Around this makeshift altar, The remaining members of the Thornberry family sat utterly motionless. Grace, 12-year-old Sarah, 8-year-old Mary, and 5-year-old William, along with several neighbors who had supposedly gone home hours earlier, but who now sat with the same empty, predatory expressions worn by Thomas and Grace. In the very center of the circle, Samuel Hawthorne knelt beside the dining table, which had been covered with a white cloth now entirely soaked with dark, ominous stains. On it lay what Dr. Putnam initially mistook for a large piece of butchered livestock, but as his eyes agonizingly adjusted to candlelight, he realized with sickening certainty that the remains were undeniably human. The body had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision, different cuts separated and meticulously arranged as it prepared for some grotesque, ritualistic feast. Arranged meticulously around the table were various containers holding what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all meticulously prepared and labeled with the same unsettling symbols that had appeared in Hawthorne's journal. The clinical precision of the butchery, combined with the ritualistic arrangement of the scene, strongly suggested that this was not a moment of random violence, but part of a carefully planned, sacred ceremony. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said without lifting his gaze from his work, his voice carrying the same calm, measured tone he had always used when discussing medical procedures. Perfect timing. We were just conducting the final stage of young Mary's initiation into the deeper mysteries of survival. You see, theoretical knowledge can only take one so far. True understanding requires direct participation in the sacred feast. Hawthorne slowly rose, his strange surgical tools gleaming in the candlelight like the implements of some ancient, dark religious ceremony. The families that disappeared in the mountains didn't simply die of cold or starvation, Doctor. They became part of something much larger and far more meaningful. They contributed to the survival of someone who could use their resources more efficiently than they ever could have managed on their own. Dr. Putnam realized with paralyzing horror that everyone else in the room was staring at him and his companions would barely control hunger, their eyes tracking every single movement with the focused attention of predators evaluating potential prey. Whatever Hawthorne had been feeding these people, whatever specific psychological conditioning he had been implementing through his medicines and teachings, had fundamentally transformed them to a level that went far beyond mere mental influence. "You've been drugging them," Putnam whispered, his voice barely audible in the candlelight, "conditioning them chemically and psychologically to accept this, to embrace the truth that your civilized society has spent centuries desperately trying to deny." Hawthorne interrupted, his voice now taking on the fervent, undeniable tone of a preacher delivering a sermon to devoted followers. "That survival absolutely requires the strong to consume the weak, that waste is the greatest sin, and that the human body provides the most perfect, efficient sustenance for human life." Hawthorne gestured proudly toward the arranged human, remains with obvious satisfaction in his work. "In my homeland, which exists wherever winter is coldest and resources are scarcest, we learn that human fellowship requires sacrifice. The many must sustain the few who are truly capable of leading them through the darkest times. These people have been transformed from weak, fearful creatures into something stronger, more unified, more fundamentally capable of surviving whatever this harsh world can inflict upon them." Reverend Greenfield, who had remained utterly silent until that moment, suddenly found his voice as the full, unimaginable horror of what he was witnessing fully penetrated his state of shock. "You're talking about cannibalism, about murder, about turning these people into monsters like yourself, abandoning every single principle that separates human beings from wild beasts." Hawthorne's resulting laugh was the most chilling sound any of them had ever heard. Not the laugh of a deranged madman, but a genuinely amused response of someone who found their ignorance more pitiable than offensive. "Monsters, Reverend? Look around you carefully. These people are demonstrably healthier than they've been all winter. Their children are growing strong and are learning skills that will serve them for life. Their families are unified in purpose in ways that your empty promises of heavenly reward could never possibly achieve. I've given them something infinitely more valuable than your abstract moral principles. I've given them the tools and the mindset to survive anything this world can inflict upon them. The confrontation that immediately followed was swift, devastatingly brutal, and unlike anything the men of Milbrook had ever experienced. Hawthorne's converts attacked the intruders with savage, terrifying coordination, moving like a pack of predators who had hunted together many times before. Their movements were fluid and practiced, strongly suggesting that this was not the first time they had been called upon to violently defend their transformed community against outside interference. Thomas Thornberry moved with inhuman speed, his farmer's hands, strengthened by years of labor, becoming claws that raked violently across Constable Hartwell's face before man could even manage to draw his weapon. Grace Thornberry produced a butcher's knife from somewhere within her blood-stained dress and advanced on Reverend Greenfield with the focused determination of someone who had been deliberately trained for exactly this situation. Most horrifying of all were the children. Sarah, Mary, and William Thornberry attacked with a coordinated effort that spoke of extensive, twisted training. Their small size allowed them to move quickly underneath the men's desperate defenses, while their complete and utter lack of fear or hesitation made them far more dangerous than their young age would suggest. They had been transformed into something that was no longer quite human, retaining their childish appearance while gaining the ruthless, predatory instincts of natural killers. Dr. Putnam found himself fighting desperately for his life against people he had known and professionally treated for years, people whose children he had delivered and whose ordinary ailments he had previously cured. But the individuals savagely attacking him bore only a passing physical resemblance to the farmers and families he had called neighbors. Their personalities, their moral frameworks, and their fundamental understanding of right and wrong had been systematically dismantled and meticulously rebuilt according to Samuel Hawthorne's twisted, survivalist philosophy. The battle was desperate, chaotic, and brutally fought with farm tools, kitchen knives, and bare hands in the confined space of the Thornberry house. The converts fought with the desperate ferocity of people defending not just their lives, but their entire, newly established worldview, while the town leaders fought with the desperation of men who understood that failure meant not only certain death, but the complete and permanent corruption of everything they held sacred. Dr. Putnam barely managed to escape, carrying word of the unfolding horror to the rest of Milbrook, while bleeding profusely from multiple wounds and perpetually haunted by images that would never leave his memory. Joshua Forrest managed to reach his horse and desperately rode toward Bennington to bring help from outside authorities, though he would ultimately never make it to his destination. The others, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornberry, and Constable Hartwell, disappeared into the unfathomable nightmare that the Thornberry house had become. By dawn, fully half of the remaining population of Milbrook was mobilizing to forcefully end Samuel Hawthorne's brutal reign of terror, but they were no longer fighting a single deranged individual. They were facing an organized, unified community of converts who had been systematically prepared for exactly this confrontation, and who regarded the approaching townspeople not as neighbors trying to save them, but as immediate enemies threatening everything they had learned to value. The siege of the Thornberry house lasted for 3 grueling days and nights, morphing into a nightmare of internal warfare fought between former neighbors who could no longer recognize each other as human beings. The unconverted townspeople, led by Dr. Putnam and a few other community leaders who had narrowly escaped Hawthorne's initial trap, found themselves fighting not merely for their lives, but for the fundamental soul of their community against people they had known and trusted implicitly for years. Samuel Hawthorne had prepared for this exact eventuality with his characteristic, chilling thoroughness. The house had been fortified with sturdy barricades and strategic defensive positions that suggested months of meticulous planning. The converts had effectively stockpiled weapons, food, and crucial medical supplies that would allow them to withstand an extended siege. Most disturbing of all, they fought with unified coordination and sophisticated tactical knowledge that indicated extensive training in organized violence. The unconverted townspeople swiftly realized they were completely outmatched. Hawthorne's followers moved throughout the house and surrounding buildings with the fluid coordination of soldiers who had drilled together extensively. They expertly used the terrain to their advantage, employing brutal ambush tactics and relentless psychological warfare that deliberately broke down the attackers' morale as much as their numbers. But perhaps the most potent weapon in Hawthorne's arsenal was the convicts themselves. Witnessing their former neighbors, friends, and family members transformed into predatory creatures utterly willing to kill and cannibalize anyone who opposed them had a devastating psychological effect on the attacking townspeople. Many simply could not bring themselves to use lethal force against people they had known since childhood, even as those people were actively trying to kill them. Dr. Putnam meticulously documented the siege in journal entries that provide the most detailed account of what experts now consider one of the most successful examples of mass psychological conversion in early American history. His writings heartbreakingly describe moments when fathers found themselves fighting their own children, when wives faced their husbands across barricades, when the fundamental bonds of community and family were revealed to be far more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. On the morning of the third day, the siege did not conclude with a clear victory for either side, but with the complete, inexplicable disappearance of Samuel Hawthorne and his most devoted followers. When the utterly exhausted townspeople finally managed to breach the house's defenses, they found it empty, save for clear evidence of hasty preparation for an immediate departure. Hawthorne and his converts had vanished into the mountains, taking with them supplies, weapons, and meticulously preserved food that would allow them to survive indefinitely in the brutal wilderness. The aftermath of Samuel Hawthorne's departure left Milbrook a broken, irrevocably scarred community that would never fully recover from a horror it had experienced. Of the 43 people who had fallen under his influence to varying degrees, only 12 were ever seen again. They slowly trickled back to town over the following weeks and months, appearing hollow-eyed and consistently refusing to speak about what they had experienced in the mountains with their former teacher. Most of these survivors left Milbrook within a year, fundamentally unable to bear the haunting memories or the perpetual, suspicious looks of their former neighbors, who could never be entirely certain that the conversion process had been truly reversed. Some moved to distant cities where they attempted to start over with completely new identities. Others simply disappeared entirely into the vast American frontier, perhaps seeking out remote communities where their changed perspectives and highly unusual skills would be less conspicuous. Dr. Putnam spent the remaining years of his life meticulously documenting everything he could recall about Hawthorne's methods, teachings, and the systematic process by which an ordinary community had been transformed into a cannibalistic cult. His extensive journals, carefully preserved in the Vermont Historical Society's restricted archives, provide the most detailed account of what experts now believe was one of America's first recorded cases of mass psychological conditioning used to successfully override fundamental moral taboos. The physical evidence was damning enough. When spring finally arrived and the heavy snows melted, search parties discovered multiple cache sites throughout the mountains, containing meticulously preserved human remains and personal effects from dozens of missing persons spanning several years. The true scale of Hawthorne's horrific activities finally became clear. He had been operating throughout New England for at least a decade, systematically preying on travelers and isolated families, while perfecting his methods of psychological manipulation and human preservation. The cache sites revealed the sophisticated nature of Hawthorne's operation. He had established permanent supply depots throughout the mountain wilderness, each containing specialized equipment for butchering, preserving, and long-term storing human flesh, along with chemical supplies for producing the addictive medicines he used to condition his victims. The sheer organization and scale of these permanent installations suggested that Hawthorne was not working entirely alone, but was likely part of a larger network of individuals engaged in similar, horrifying activities throughout the northeastern wilderness. But perhaps the single most disturbing discovery came in late April, when a local hunter stumbled upon what appeared to be a permanent settlement located deep in the mountains, far from any established trails or known settlements. The site included sophisticated food preservation equipment, specialized medical instruments of unusual design, workshops for producing the strange tools and clothing that Hawthorne had carried, and detailed journals documenting his extensive experiments in what he chillingly referred to as survival psychology. These journals chillingly revealed that his activities in Milbrook were not random predation, or even simple cannibalism driven by mere hunger or madness. They were part of a carefully planned and methodically executed experiment in creating self-sustaining communities based on what Hawthorne described as post-civilizational survival protocols. His ultimate, terrifying goal was apparently to develop proven techniques for maintaining human communities during extended periods of societal collapse, using methods that deliberately abandon conventional moral constraints in favor of pure, ruthless survival efficiency. The journals describe similar experiments conducted in other isolated communities throughout New England over a period of nearly 15 years, each following the exact same basic pattern. Infiltration during times of severe crisis, the swift establishment of trust through genuine medical assistance, the gradual introduction of unconventional survival practices, systematic psychological conditioning to overcome all moral resistance, and finally, either the complete conversion of the community or the swift elimination of witnesses, followed by relocation to a new testing ground. Most chilling of all were the detailed entries describing Hawthorne's long-term plans for significantly expanding his operations. He had already identified dozens of other vulnerable communities throughout the northeastern mountains and had developed comprehensive, specific strategies for successfully infiltrating and converting each one. His ultimate vision appeared to be the systematic creation of a resilient network of cannibalistic communities that could effectively support each other through the harshest winters and the most severe societal disruptions, gradually and insidiously spreading his chilling philosophy throughout the isolated regions of New England and eventually far beyond. The journals also chillingly revealed that Hawthorne was not the original architect of the sophisticated system, but rather a dedicated field operative working for what appeared to be a much larger, more highly organized entity dedicated to developing and testing survival strategies for an anticipated societal collapse. Repeated references to the council and the directors strongly suggested that his horrific work was being meticulously monitored and guided by individuals with extensive resources, long-term planning capabilities, and a disturbing foresight. Samuel Hawthorne himself was never captured, despite extensive searches conducted by local authorities, federal marshals, and military units specifically deployed to hunt down what officials privately termed the Milbrook incident. No tangible trace of him was found after his sudden departure from the town, leading to widespread speculation about his ultimate fate and whereabouts. Some initial investigators theorized that he had simply died in the unforgiving wilderness, unable to survive without the established support structure he had built in Milbrook. Others believed he had simply moved on to a new, distant region, ready to immediately begin his horrific work again in a place where no one would recognize his methods or connect him to the pattern of previous incidents. The truth, however, may be more profoundly disturbing than either theory suggests. In 1851, just 4 years after the Milbrook incident, reports began to surface from isolated communities in northern Maine of a helpful stranger who opportunistically appeared during harsh winters, offering medical assistance and survival advice to struggling families. In 1854, strikingly similar reports emerged from remote areas of New Hampshire, describing a man with pale eyes and exceptional medical knowledge who seemed to understand exactly what people desperately needed to hear during their darkest moments of crisis. Each of these subsequent incidents followed the exact same devastating pattern that had ravaged Milbrook: arrival during crisis, the swift establishment of unwavering trust through effective medical treatment, the gradual introduction of unconventional and extreme practices, and eventually either the complete conversion of the target community or a sudden cluster of mysterious disappearances, followed by the stranger's immediate departure. The last confirmed sighting of someone definitively matching Hawthorne's detailed description came in 1859 in a remote mining camp in northern Michigan, where desperate, brutal conditions during an unusually severe winter had left the miners highly vulnerable to anyone offering hope and assistance. Witnesses described a man with pale eyes and hair prematurely streaked with white, who claimed to originate from distant lands beyond the great forests where the old ways of survival are still honored. He remained at the camp for 3 long months, actively helping the miners survive conditions that had already tragically killed several of their number. His specialized medicines were remarkably effective. His advice concerning food preservation and rationing kept the camp adequately supplied through the worst of the winter, and his strong leadership helped maintain morale during weeks when the temperature never managed to rise above zero. When spring finally arrived and the mining company supply wagons belatedly reached the camp, Hawthorne had vanished, taking with him 12 members of the mining community who were never seen or heard from again. The mining company's official records, discovered decades later during research into industrial accidents of the 1850s, included disturbing details about the condition of the camp when the relief wagons arrived. The remaining miners exhibited behavioral changes entirely consistent with those observed in the Milbrook survivors: obsessive hoarding of food, unusual dietary preferences often involving raw meat, and complex social dynamics that strongly suggested the community had developed hierarchical structures based on principles very different from conventional mining camp organization. Dr. Putnam's final journal entry, written shortly before his death from pneumonia in 1863, contained a stark, chilling warning that has haunted researchers and law enforcement officials for over a century. The man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something about human nature that civilized people prefer to ignore, that under the right conditions, with the proper techniques and sufficient patience, anyone can be convinced that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but absolutely necessary for survival. He didn't create monsters from ordinary people. He revealed the monsters that already existed within them, merely waiting for permission to emerge. Putnam's warning proved tragically prophetic in ways he could not have fully anticipated. The American Civil War, which began just 14 years after the Milbrook incident, provided numerous devastating examples of ordinary citizens committing atrocities that would have been utterly unthinkable under normal circumstances. The subsequent industrial disasters and massive social upheavals of the late 19th century repeatedly demonstrated just how quickly civilized communities could descend into savage competition for basic resources when mere survival became the absolute primary concern. Modern psychological research has since confirmed many of Dr. Putnam's astute observations about the precise techniques Samuel Hawthorne used to convert an entire community to his twisted worldview. Studies of cult indoctrination, military conditioning, and extreme survival psychology have identified the same basic principles that Hawthorne applied with such devastating systemic effectiveness. The gradual introduction of extreme concepts, the immediate creation of dependency relationships, forced isolation from alternative viewpoints, and the systematic breaking down of moral boundaries through incremental, small steps that each initially seemed reasonable in context. This chilling mystery ultimately shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often originate not from supernatural forces or random acts of violence, but from the systematic, deliberate exploitation of human psychology by individuals who deeply understand how to manipulate our most fundamental instincts and deepest needs. The enduring story of Samuel Hawthorne serves as a stark reminder that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, and that the line separating the healer from the destroyer, the teacher from the corrupter, can disappear entirely when survival becomes the only virtue that truly matters. Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there be more to Samuel Hawthorne's true identity and the organization he apparently served? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really drove this man to such extremes, and whether his network of survival communities might still exist in remote areas of our country. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that make you question how much we really know about the people around us. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter from the shadows of American history that authorities tried to bury forever,